All right, welcome to the PowerPoint material on critical race theories. In this lecture, I'm going to echo and extend some of the theoretical concepts and assumptions that were described in your readings on this topic. Critical race theory or theories is a really big area, and others will have outlined additional theoretical assumptions, but these are the four highlighted by Burton et al. That are perhaps the most relevant for the field of family studies. So the first one is that race is an organizing factor in systems, including families. And we can see this, for example, in the research on ethnic racial socialization by parents to youth. The second one, racism is institutionalized. So this is more about institutional racism that, for example, white people have historically had more economic resources and power due to the institution of slavery, and this has perpetuated itself over the generations. Racial profiling is another example of the institutionalization of racism. The third one is our social practices reproduce racialized social subsystems. We're going to be getting into this more with concepts associated with implicit bias, white privilege, racialization, racialized practices. The last one, racial and ethnic identities and also the power associated with them are socially constructed. And we're going to be talking more about the social construction of race. The idea of race assumes that people can be divided into groups based on a genotype or a phenotype, what's visible, and that these groups have meaningful distinctions. Race initially appears to be biological, fixed, unchangeable, yet it's actually socially constructed. There can be mismatches in your own racial self-identification with how others might identify you. There's no actual gene for race. Scholars can't agree on how many races exist, and research shows that your race can change when social circumstances change. So, for example, in America and Britain, at different points in time in history, the Irish, Italian, Greeks, and Jews were all considered to be members of a non-white race, even though most Irish, for example, are whiter than other whites. Another example is the one-drop rule talked about in Rockmore and Henderson that existed here in the U.S., where if you had one drop of African American blood, then you were considered to be black. For the very first time in 2000, the U.S. Census, we allowed people to identify themselves as more than one race. We are starting to realize it's not so fixed and people can't be put into one neat little box. And young people are choosing often two categories for race instead of just one. People who study race are starting to advocate the term colorism rather than racism to talk about the practices of favoring people with lighter skin over darker skin or perceiving lighter skin to be more favorable. And, as an example, we can see in many countries around the world practices of skin bleaching or trying to keep skin from getting darker or hair straightening. This term is gaining even more relevance as we deconstruct race and we have more and more interracial births, and we have less of an ability to feel like we can categorize based on race. Racialization is also referred to as racial stratification, and it's the idea that we are, whether consciously or unconsciously, assigning meaning to real or perceived or ascribed differences among individuals and groups. And then this meaning kind of produces some hierarchies of power and privilege. So racialization or racial stratification basically forms the basis for racism, discrimination, and inequality. And we'll be getting into some more examples. Interviewers were asked to record their assessment of whether or not respondents were white or black or other at the end of interviews. And this data shows us that people who are unemployed, incarcerated, or impoverished are more likely to be classified as black and less likely to be classified as white, regardless of how they were classified or identified previously. So the no bar is indication of incarceration, unemployment, impoverished, so no or yes for each of those three things. Figure A shows us that of the people classified as white in the previous year, what percentage is classified as white in the current year based on whether or not they're incarcerated, unemployed, or impoverished. So we can see, for example, that although 100% of people in Figure A were classified as white in the previous year, only 90% of the incarcerated respondents are still seen as white in the next year. In this same research study, respondents were also asked to self-report their own race in 1979 and again in 2002. Again, we have the yes or no, meaning ever incarcerated, ever employed, or ever impoverished. And so we can see that in Figure A, 100% of these folks self-identified as white in 1979. 23 years later, however, only 81% of those who had been incarcerated still said they were white, compared with 95% who were never incarcerated. So what we can see is that race is not a set or a fixed category, and we assign privilege and power based on race and skin color. And if you are not meeting the norms of a particular racial category, then you might even self-identify as a different racial category, that we have maybe stereotypes that match, that you're more likely to be incarcerated or employed or impoverished. So it's an example of racialization, how we assign kind of identities or privileges and then reinforce them based on skin color. It is tempting to say that we are colorblind and that skin color doesn't matter to us and we never take it into account, but as we'll see, research suggests that's probably not true anyway, and when we take a colorblind stance, we ignore the real differences and discriminations that people face. So instead of colorblindness, we're going for racial literacy, that we understand that still around the world there is value in having white skin, that colorism and racism is still a current issue, that we can discuss it, and that we understand that we have racialized kind of assumptions and practices, even if we're not, consciously racist. So when I was in college, I had this t-shirt actually, and it was one of my favorites. I was really enamored with this sentiment, and I similarly loved a poem by Maya Angelou called The Human Family, in which she repeats, "In minor ways we differ, in major we're the same." I was really kind of attached to this idea that we're all the same. So let's ponder that for a minute and think about kind of the pros and cons of this ideology. And you may have heard other people echo sentiments like this. And so on the one hand, it's great that I'm trying to see everyone as equal and having the same basic desires and needs and rights. But on the con side, it exemplifies colorblindness, that I'm kind of implying that everybody has the same power and rights and experiences that I do as a more privileged white person, and I'm ignoring the discrimination and stigma that many people around the world face. The project implicit association test, it has provided some of the more So this is from a very famous article by Peggy McIntosh on unpacking the knapsack of white privilege. If you haven't read it before, it's worth reviewing. But Peggy McIntosh did an amazing job, for that time of kind of illustrating what some of the privileges, the hidden privileges that she had as a white person. And I think of things like this all the time. That just even, for example, a privilege I have when I move out in the world is that when people seem cranky with me or look at me in maybe an unpleasant way, I don't even have to wonder most of the time if it's about my skin color, right? That doesn't even cross my mind. So intersectionality, this theoretical concept, came out of both feminist and critical race theories. One of the originators of the idea is Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually came and spoke at CSU in recent years. And so intersectionality, I think, as many of you know, is just this idea that not only are our identities constructed based on intersectionalities around kind of often key demographic characteristics, but the power and privilege and discrimination associated with each of those characteristics also has interlocking influence. So the idea being, people were often researching, family studies where researchers were looking at what it means to be, for example, to have darker skin and maybe the racism that came along with that. And then others were looking at, the challenges associated with being a woman, and the sexism that came along with that. And then other people were looking at, what it meant to be gay and the heterosexism that came along with that. And then finally people were like, but what about the women who are lesbian and Black, right? Now we've got this intersectionality of both identities and, areas of discrimination. Here's some additional theoretical constructs that are built on critical race theories. So part of racial literacy is being able to have conversations about race and tolerate the discomfort. So there's a useful term here called white fragility that's becoming more popular that kind of labels what happens for many of us as white people, or has happened when confronted with maybe persons of color's frustration or anger about race and racism, that white people could get so kind of overwhelmed with their own emotion that they can't engage, or they avoid out of fear or guilt or defensiveness. And so we want to be thinking this, even though undesirable, is perhaps a common response. And so how can we acknowledge maybe that tendency, especially, if we're a white person, but, move beyond it. And so I encourage you to think about people you see who do this well, who avoid kind of white fragility as a white person. I ran across this study and thought that it could be a powerful example of white fragility. But you should know that the author is really using it as making the case for intra-racial discrimination, which is the idea that people of color who are outspoken about racism suffer greater penalties. So I do think, obviously, that's the main point, but consider whether or not this could also represent white fragility, which is a little less studied right now. So in order to investigate whether white admissions counselors might be kind of deterring those who were more racially active or outspoken against racism, this researcher came up with, made some distinctly Black names like Lakeisha Lewis or Kashwan Grant, and then he developed email accounts for each one. And then he created 4 email templates in which the Black student, expressed interest in one of those 4 areas you can see on the slide, and one of those being anti-racism or racial justice. And then in each one, the fictitious student asked if she or he would be a good fit for the school based on their interests and activities. And then he sent a random sample of over 500 white admissions counselors at private, historically predominantly white colleges across the U.S. He sent them 2 of the 4 emails about 1 month apart. And what he found is that on average, white admissions counselors were 26% less likely to respond to the emails of Black students whose interests or involvements focused on anti-racism and racial justice. And this was particularly the case if the admissions counselor was male, in which they were in general 37% less likely to respond to either Black or female students who expressed an interest in anti-racist activism. And if the Black student was also female, then that number went up to 50% less likely to respond. And so in my mind, this kind of exemplifies this stress or tension that the white admissions counselor might have felt in the face of anti-racism dialogue, and that they avoided it. They kind of shut it down. Walsdorf and colleagues wrote an article really challenging the field of family studies to situate white supremacy in its theorizing about families and its research about families. And so, we all have kind of vague notions of white supremacy as associated with, the KKK, but, what is it really? And so here's some definitions, because it can be challenging to wrap your mind around this construct. So white supremacy has been defined as a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. It's also been referred to as a multi-dimensional system of domination, or that white people are recreating dominance through the normalization of racial hierarchy and controlling material resources and power. So once we have a lens of white supremacy, then we can look back on some of these other theoretical constructs that we've talked about. So from the view of white supremacy, a colorblind ideology is just implicit white supremacy. Explicit white supremacy were laws, like the one-drop rule or bans on interracial marriage. But implicit white supremacy is ignoring, racism and discrimination that is existing. White privilege, which has been a really powerful and important construct in recent years, from the lens of white supremacy, this concept is lacking because it overlooks the role of white people in perpetuating it. Racial stratification, again, then would be seen as the perpetuation of white supremacy, as would be white fragility. Okay, so the SNAF is actually one of my favorite theoretical constructs about the family because it's just so useful and a quick shorthand for kind of referring to this kind of default standard North American family that is often kind of the invisible gold standard that we are holding up as a real family and then comparing everybody else to. It was a term coined, by Smith in 1993, so quite a while ago. So we often call it the SNAF. And so this is white, heterosexual, married, biological, middle-class families. And it's easy to, when you think of family, kind of for some of us, especially those of us who grew up in SNAFs and are in SNAFs, to imagine the SNAF. So we have to challenge ourselves on not always thinking of the SNAF. But we also have to recognize the pervasiveness of the SNAF and how it has impacted family studies research and theorizing. So in their article, on white supremacy in the field of family studies and family theory, Walsdorf and colleagues kind of call on family scholars to do a few things. So first, they call on family scholars to situate white supremacy in the chain of causality, essentially, the etiology of different phenomenon. So we often maybe start with disadvantage, or we start with poverty, or we start with racism, and really as kind of the initial causal factor. And what they want to suggest is that perhaps white supremacy is, in many cases, the first factor in this causal chain. And so how can we begin to make that more explicit in our research? They also suggest that we, because the default, right, SNAF, for example, white privilege is always kind of hidden, that we need to name, analyze, and measure family privilege and perhaps white entitlement as much as we're measuring disadvantage. That we could add a lot as family scholars to more deeply understand how white people become racist. And then, of course, as family scholars, that we need to acknowledge and move past our own white fragility.